Hey, today is day 266. We're reading the whole Bible this year, and today we read Esther 1 through 5. Esther, the entire book, is a chiasm. Now, if you remember, chi is the Greek letter X, or if you kind of diagram scripture, it kind of goes in and then hits a center point and then goes back out in kind of reverse order. It's the entire book. You go from the beginning toward the middle, and then looking at the end backwards, you find matching stories all the way in. You see it starts and ends with splendor and two banquets, one for the king at the beginning and for Mordecai at the end. Come in a step, Esther becomes queen and Mordecai saves the king. On the other side of that, you have Queen Esther and Mordecai saving all the Jews. Come in again, the elevation of Haman at the beginning, but then you have the elevation of Mordecai at the end. Go in one more. You have decrees. You have Haman's decree to have all the Jews executed. Then you have Mordecai's counter decree that undoes or saves the Jews against destruction. Come in one more. You have Esther and Mordecai planning to reverse the decree. At the very middle, the thing where it turns it all around, are the two banquets that Esther holds for the king and Mordecai. And right in the middle, where everything flips, is Mordecai gets credit for having saved the king and is elevated, and Haman is the one who has to tell everyone to praise him. Oh, with the banquets, the other thing, there's a banquet and then plans for execution on this post. The first time it's a banquet, and then Haman erects this giant spike and goes, I'm going to put Mordecai on that thing. But then it gets flipped. And after the next banquet, Haman gets executed on that spike. We have these matching and this reversal of events that lead to the salvation of, in that moment, of the Jews. One more really interesting thing, the name of God, Adonai, Yahweh, is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Not one time. In fact, because of that, there was a move about a century and a half, 2 centuries before Jesus. There were some who tried to get Esther removed from the Jewish Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, because they didn't believe that the book really belonged there, because it doesn't mention God even one time. And yet, the whole way through, we're meant to see and recognize God's hand at work throughout the entire thing. So let's get into it and take a look and see if we can find where that is all the way through. So chapter 1, this is at the end of the exile. Many Jews are still in foreign lands, even though many, as we've begun to read in Ezra and Nehemiah, many are already returned or returning to their homeland. And so this centers around Esther and Mordecai. But first, we meet King Xerxes. He's not that great a guy. He's thrown a party, and to impress all of his noble and rich friends, he wants his beautiful wife to come and dance for all of them and put on a show. And when she won't do it, he gets very angry. He deposes her, and then he issues a decree that just sort of like men can rule their own house the way they see fit and blah, blah, blah. Doesn't seem to be all that great a guy, but he's the king that we're working with. In chapter 2, we begin to see that all of this is, one, given as a juxtaposition to the way the book ends with the elevation of Mordecai, but also it sets up this opportunity for this young Jewish girl, Esther, to rise to a very prominent place. She enters this beauty pageant where they get a year's worth of training on how to be, formal and presentable to the king and everything. And honestly, there's not a lot of godly activity in any of it, but she's very beautiful and she ends up winning. She goes by Esther instead of her Hebrew name Hadassah, and she's chosen by the king as the most beautiful, most wanted, most desirable woman, and she gets to become queen. That doesn't mean that she's now like sitting on the throne and ruling. She's more just the top choice wife for this king. As we see later, she doesn't even have the right to go and meet with him officially unless he calls for her. In chapter 3, we meet Haman, who is son of Hamadatha the Agagite. That might be something you just pass right over unless you realize that Agag was one of the rulers or one of the small kingdoms in the land of the Canaanites. He is like an arch enemy of the Jews from when they first entered the promised land. So there's deep-seated blood feud in here, inherent conflict in this scenario where Haman is elevated in this kingdom as well as Esther being Jewish. But the confrontation comes through Mordecai, who refuses to bow down or pay homage to Haman. It's somewhat of a form of worship. There's echoes of like what happens with Daniel in these days. Since the Lord is never mentioned and there's no direct, like, you're not honoring my God or anything like that. And that is never mentioned here. It's almost as if Esther is written by someone who's not Jewish, but is close to all of these events. They have intimate knowledge of all these things that happen, but they do not have the knowledge of God. And this account of what their faith really meant to them in this, and they made it just about people who were faithful to their culture and ways. It almost looks like a secular telling of events where the Christian might go like, do you not see God's hand all throughout that? Look at how he delivered you. Look at how he did this. If you just acknowledge him. And this is, oftentimes kind of the conversations that I end up having with people talking about either pre-salvation or as they're coming to Christ and as they're starting to realize all that God has been doing in their life and how they really should be following him. Or sometimes even just as somebody's looking back and sharing their testimony and going like, I never realized how much God was actually in all these things. And they would tell it this way. And then looking back and going, oh, if I actually pay attention to where God was moving here, I can see his hand there and his plans here. I see his providence in all of these things. And I think that's part of what we're supposed to see. And I think maybe somebody who, maybe it wasn't Esther or Mordecai, but one of her attendants or somebody who actually wrote this down, and then it got passed on and sent back to those who had returned from the exile. This account of what had happened in the capital of Persia while they were reestablishing Jerusalem and rebuilding the wall and everything. Chapter 2 ends with Mordecai hearing about a conspiracy to kill the king, telling Esther, and Esther telling the king, and it saves his life. And so then he writes down, like, gives credit to Mordecai, but sort of forgets about it. And that comes up later. After Mordecai has this kind of conflict with Haman, we end up with this decree that all the Jews on this day will all be killed. And it's a ways away. And so there's time to figure something out, but they need to figure something out. And so in chapter 4, then Mordecai goes to Esther and talks to her. And this is where we get that famous passage, perhaps you're here for such a time as this. And once again, they're just brushing right up against acknowledging and declaring the providence of God and not outright saying it in this book. But it's meant to be there. And it's one of those things that if there's any validity to any moment where in our culture or whatever, when people are talking about like, oh, it's meant to be, like, that's either God meant it to be or not. There's no other source or purpose for how things come to be that are meant to be. And that's kind of the implication throughout this. And so Esther, she says, gather all the Jews together and fast. Fasting is for the purpose of prayer, to remove all distraction and to sacrifice one's own bodily needs in order to seek the Lord more clearly and passionately and devotedly in the hope that he would speak to us. And so this absolutely brutal fast, 3 days and nights with no food or drink, is hardcore. But again, it doesn't even say that they're praying, but the implication is that they would be. And so they fast and pray, and then she goes in and she could be put to death, but perhaps she won't be. And Mordecai's like, look, if you don't go, then what's going to happen? Somehow or other, salvation will come to us, but you won't get credit for it. In fact, you will end up being penalized for not standing up for your people when you had the chance. And so again, it's strange that it doesn't quite acknowledge God there, but the implication still is God's going to bring deliverance one way or another. Do you want to be part of that? Do you want to be on board with what God is doing? And more than any sort of like romantic, this is not a romantic book at all. There's no beautiful romance between Esther and the king and all that. Throw all that away. It's not a fantasy novel for girls. This is about people being faithful in the situation they're given. This is a end of the exile version of Joseph being elevated up, of Daniel being elevated up the ranks of pagan nations. That's what this is. This is an outside view that's not giving decrees of the Lord all the way through, but instead just looking at this is what it looks like to see a picture of God's providence. It's still all there. It's so obvious. It's all through there. And all we have to do is just see it. And so Esther does approach the king. She's shown favor because, again, obviously the Lord is with her. Like, that's why all of this is working out. The Lord is with her. And she says, I want to prepare this feast for you and Haman. And so she does, and she gets them there. And then she goes, okay, come tomorrow and I'll tell you everything I wanted to tell you about. And then Haman leaves that feast feeling pretty good about himself because he's the only one who had this exclusive audience with the king and Queen Esther. And then he leaves, and while he's in high spirits, he sets up this executioner's stake for Mordecai to be placed on. And that's where we leave it for this chapter, for this half of the book. And so we'll get the rest tomorrow. But as we look at the beginning, all the way through, even though there's this plot against the Jews and the name of God is never acknowledged or mentioned even once, all throughout, we see the work and the hand of God moving. I'm challenged, and I want to challenge you to be more aware of all the places in your life where God is not overtly acknowledged. And yet, where is he moving? Because the Lord is not lazy or absent in any event that has happened. Where is his hand? Where is he calling you? And if we have ears to hear, if we have eyes to see, where is he calling our attention to acknowledge and move according to his word, his hand, his presence? So that's what I'm looking for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and comments. So let's talk about that in the chat or in the Bible app. I hope that you are drawing nearer to God every day as you were digging into the word with us. So keep at it and be rad for Jesus.